I think the problem that we have with the nuclear industry is that electric utilities, which have been the traditional sponsors of nuclear power plants and the typical operators, they're not very good at building new large scale reactors. And that's looking back over the last 50 years. They can't complete them on time and on budget. There are a lot of extenuating circumstances to explain that, particularly with regard to ever changing safety regulations at the NRC. But electric utilities have a weak track record in terms of constructing reactors. And that's continued to the current day. 20 years ago, we made our last attempt at a nuclear renaissance, at kickstarting the industry after 20 years of lying dormant. Under the Bush administration, they passed the Energy Policy Act of 2005. Well, fast forward 20 years. In that time, we've only completed 2 new large-scale reactors, and those were only completed within the last 2 years. And they came in at the highest price ever for a new reactor, roughly $16,000 per kilowatt. So the problem is mainly financial at this point because electric utilities are not willing to take the risk, in particular the financial risk to their companies, of attempting another large greenfield construction project. And we need to acknowledge that electric utilities in general have grown more risk averse since deregulation back in the 1980s. And they make a regulated return of 8 to 10%, but the people running these electric utilities are just not being paid to take speculative risk around new construction. And for the people who actually run these companies, there's a lot of personal career downside. If you get it wrong with a failed nuclear reactor project, it will lead to potentially a ratings downgrade for your company, higher borrowing costs. Perhaps it forces the sale of your company because of the financial stress. But for management, clearly it's going to put you out of a job if you get that wrong. So I think we need to acknowledge the fact that no one in the electric utility industry right now is willing to take that financial risk, either corporate or personal. And that would be confirmed by the fact that there are no orders right now for an AP1000 or any other large-scale nuclear reactor in terms of building new plants. So we need to acknowledge that fact and where we are right now, and basically come up with a new approach that disaggregates the 2 phases of a nuclear reactor. The construction phase, which is very high risk, and then the operating phase. In the operating phase, electric utilities are very good at running plants and keeping the lights on. We need to come up with a new class of sponsors that can manage the risks and execute during the construction phase. So, it's our argument in the paper that we've just published that infrastructure private equity can fill the current gap that we have with regard to starting up nuclear plant construction. The problem we have is that electric utilities are not willing to take the risk, so we need to come in with a new category of sponsors during the construction phase. And we think that infrastructure private equity managers can fill this gap. They have not up until now played in the nuclear space, but they clearly have greenfield and development experience in other verticals, including building airport terminals, building LNG terminals, bridges and highways. And all that experience is fungible and could be applied to nuclear construction. They're also sitting on a lot of capital that could be reallocated towards the nuclear space that would tick off a lot of boxes, whether it's North America or energy or climate and transition related. Nuclear would fill all of those requirements. So we do think that infrastructure private equity has a role to play in restarting the industry. Success would look like basically execution. We need proof of concept. So as fast as possible, we should get a number of projects green lighted, sited, most likely at existing nuclear power plants that have room for expansion or recently retired coal plants. Again, you want to minimize the other infrastructure and delays, and both of those categories of sites would have existing transmission. And then, these companies, these infrastructure private equity managers just need to execute. We need to build large-scale nuclear reactors. And I think we should focus on the AP1000, which we've just completed in the last 2 years. We know how to build it. A lot of the costs that were layered on to the plants at Vogtle were non-recurring. And so we should just prove that we can build the AP1000 on a timely, cost-effective basis. And I would define that as within 5 years. So it will take, best case, 5 years to complete each nuclear power plant. We need to start up the queue of construction projects now to really start to move the needle within the next 10 years. And I think what the government can do, and again, the Trump administration has come out with a number of executive orders related to nuclear, which will be helpful. In particular, the reforms that are talking about at the NRC. Also, the Department of Energy will play a role by reallocating some of the funds that are available through their loan program office towards the nuclear side. Those are not subsidies or grants. They're basically low-cost debt that will be repaid once the project is completed. But I think that's important right now in terms of getting the industry back on its feet. And then once we have successful execution, I think industry and the financial markets will take over. Finance, having worked on Wall Street for 40 years, it's basically a manufacturing operation. Once you have proof of concept and transactions that work, there's no problem replicating it and then starting up the manufacturing operation. I think that's what you will see if we can get over the next 5+ years and prove that the concept works. So the Vogtle plant, units 3 and 4, were the first next generation reactors that we've built in this country in the last 30 years. So it's a new technology. It's a Westinghouse technology. It's 1.1 gigawatts. So we always knew it was going to be a learning experience. I think the problem we have is that the lessons being taken away from Vogtle are the wrong ones. And we should acknowledge that whenever you have this first of a kind exercise, the first mover is always at a disadvantage. I mean, the typical argument is that there's an advantage being the first mover. I don't think that's true when it comes to nuclear reactor technology. So we always knew things were probably going to go wrong. But if you look at Vogtle and the problem with those 2 units, which were just completed in the last 2 years, they took twice as long to complete. The budget came in at more than double what it was originally estimated. And the cost, the sticker shock is out there. They came in at $16,000 per kilowatt. But if you look at the details and the reasons why the costs were so inflated, most of that was non-recurring. Pretty much all of it was idiosyncratic. And I think the industry needs to, and people who are following the nuclear industry need to be aware and acknowledge that fact and adjust for it. If you look at Vogtle, the problems, I mean, it really was a series of unfortunate events, a lot of which cascaded. They were the first time builders of the AP1000. The NRC, which has always been a chronic problem when it comes to nuclear construction, they changed some of the rules at the beginning of the process after they had already approved the design to make the reactor shell impervious to a theoretical commercial jet hit, right? So that delayed it a few years at the outset. But I think the fundamental flaw that we had with Vogtle was that Westinghouse was the engineering, procurement, and construction contractor on the project. Now, Westinghouse is very good at designing reactors, and they predominate in the U.S. industry. We have more than 60 different nuclear reactor designs right now that are operating in the U.S. That have been designed by Westinghouse. So they're very good at designing reactors. They had never built a nuclear reactor up until the Vogtle project. And that showed. They also stretched themselves because it wasn't just the two Vogtle units that they were building at the time. They were also building two same-sized AP1000 reactors in South Carolina for another utility sponsor. So they stretched themselves both operationally and financially. And probably the real fatal flaw is that they went to construction and started without detailed engineering plans. And anyone who's built a house or engaged in a large home contracting project knows that if you have change orders, it's going to add to the cost and delay everything. And the compounding factor that you also had was that because this was the first time build in a generation, we were working with a different licensing approach from the NRC. And back 20 years ago, they had combined both the construction and the operating license together, the thought being that that would streamline the process and make it easier. It actually did the opposite because it made every change order of that combined operating and construction license, it required a new rulemaking by the NRC. So it was a very rigid, delayed process. And the delay was most of the cost in terms of increasing it, because if you look at nuclear construction, financing costs are a big component of it. So just doubling the time of construction from 5 to 10 to 11 years added several $1 billion onto the price tag for this project. So I think we need to go through and pro forma for all of these excess costs that we won't have to worry about in the next build. And I think the good news around Vogtle is that it left us a blueprint for the next AP1000 construction project. Detailed engineering plans that have been approved by the NRC. So all it really will take is a competent EPC contractor and sponsor to make sure that they adhere to those blueprints, minimize any future change orders, and then they should be able to complete it at a much lower cost that is still attractive to a utility buyer. Yeah, I think it's a first principle that a reliable electricity grid is what supports, a modern, industrialized, developed economy. It's the key to GDP growth, living standards, manufacturing activity. The main reason why so many emerging market countries have volatile economic growth and lower living standards is because their electricity grids are not reliable. They go down for hours or days at a time. And you just can't use that as the basis for a developed economy. And I think the other problem too is it's really a life and death issue. If you have a grid that goes down, depending on what time of year it is, whether it's very hot or very cold, then it's going to lead to higher mortality, right? People will die, particularly during the winter. So it's going to expose populations to the elements again, which is something that we haven't had to deal with in more than a century. Lulled into this false sense of security. Maybe it's a stupor, but over the last 10 years, in this country and Europe as well, and other countries, we've allowed intermittent wind and solar generation into the generation mix. And we need to get back to basics. You really can't run a developed economy when your electricity generation is variable and dependent on the weather. Now, I think over the last 10 years, the fact that U.S. electricity demand has been flat and hasn't really grown has kind of lulled us into this false sense of security. But now the fact that everyone is in agreement that increased demand from the technology sector, in particular data centers, as well as large industrial users, we're now looking at growth in the 1% to 2% range per annum, similar to what we saw back in the 90s. And so I think that now is disabusing everyone of any notion that renewables, wind and solar, can be used to meet such projected load growth. So that in itself, I think, is a good thing if it's waking people up. But I think we need to get back to the first principle that we can only allow dispatchable power into the grid. And that means our choices are, right now, coal, natural gas, and nuclear. And I'm not saying we should put all of our eggs in one basket. I think we should have a mix of all three, because you never know what will happen in terms of the supply chain or the feedstock cost for any one of those particular sources. So it's best to have a diversified grid, but again, diversified only between dispatchable. All of the above does not work unless it's dispatchable if we're talking about electricity. So I think nuclear obviously will play a big role of those three, because if you look at it, it runs for 80 years. It's got the longest life of all three. And even though the upfront construction costs are high, the overall cost over the operating life are very low and attractive. It's also able to run 24/7 effectively. It has the highest capacity factors. They're well over 90%. And it's also zero emissions, not to the extent that that should be a driver of policy, but there clearly are people on the other side of the aisle and environmental activists that are focused on that. So there should be some common ground that can be found around nuclear because of the fact that it has zero emissions. So it's dispatchable with zero emissions. It clearly is a better alternative than wind and solar. Well, if you look at energy policy, over the last, 20 to 25 years in this country, it clearly has been hijacked by climate regulations and other considerations. But I think nuclear is something that we can find common ground on. It's dispatchable. It runs 24/7. It also is zero emissions. So the people on the left, and again, climate is a political issue, so we need to be frank when we discuss it, and clearly it's a left-right issue, it's a Democratic versus Republican issue, generally speaking, and it's a partisan issue. But there should be bipartisan agreement about nuclear at this point in time, again, because it is zero emissions, and it's very long-lived. Now, in order to come to that common agreement, though, I think environmental activists and Democrats in general need to drop many of the safety issues that they've used to argue against nuclear over the decades, really. And with the benefit of hindsight, we know that all of those safety regulation claims and concerns have proven spurious over the last several decades. That has also been a problem in terms of the arrested development of the U.S. nuclear industry. You've had these safety issues that have flared up at points in time. You've had an overreaction by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and that has led to basically a stalling in the normal learning process for the industry and the normal development of the industry. So you had 3 Mile Island that came in the late 70s. That led to an overreaction. We had Chernobyl in the 80s, and then we had Fukushima in 2011. And again, there was an overreaction to each one, not just in this country. I mean, Europe clearly overreacted to Fukushima, and there were a number of extenuating circumstances around each of those operating incidents, none of which proved catastrophic for the local communities. So I think the left needs to get over their safety issues that they've raised perpetually around nuclear and get on board with the fact that, or focus more importantly on its zero emissions, since that clearly has been more of a priority for many Democrats, environmentalists over the last several years. And if they do that, I think, we can clear the way for approvals around, nuclear construction again in this country. And I do think it should be large-scale reactors. If we really want to move the needle in terms of capacity, like the Trump administration wants to do, we need to build what we know, and we know how to build large-scale reactors. SMRs, which are kind of the new shiny object when it comes to talking about nuclear. We've never built any. We don't know if they're going to be cheaper. We don't know if they're going to be, other technological surprises as we try to bring them online and commercialize them. So we should stick with what we know, and there should be broad agreement on both sides of the aisle for doing that. Yeah, I think the problem we've had in the last few years is that we have kind of turned a blind eye to all the deficiencies of renewables. Obviously, there's been a big political push um, by both the federal and state government, depending on who's in office, to get renewables into the electricity mix. And there have been a lot of subsidies that have been thrown at the industry over the years. Um, but the arguments made for why we should continue to do that really don't hold up. Um, in terms of the cost, a lot of that is subsidized. Those subsidies are now going away after the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. We're finally going to sunset a lot of these long-standing subsidies that have been thrown at wind and solar. Um, in terms of being quicker to build, again, if you look at all the ancillary infrastructure that you need, in particular transmission infrastructure to connect up this disparate asset base of wind turbines and solar panels, it really doesn't save a lot of time. If you look at the PGM regional market, they've approved a lot of wind and solar projects, which are now stuck in the queue because they're waiting for transmission interconnections. So it's not as quick and it's not as cheap as the people promoting wind and solar would have you believe. Also, they ignore the fact that it's intermittent. It doesn't run all the time. It runs when the weather obliges. It's variable by definition. In recent years, some advocates of renewables have tried to make the argument that with battery storage, it's effectively dispatchable. That's not true. Batteries will only get you a few hours. They don't help you if it's cloudy or the wind doesn't blow for several days in a row. So it's not the same as dispatchable power like coal and natural gas and nuclear. And if you look at the capacity factors for wind and solar, that's obvious. It runs 25 to 35% of the time, depending on what part of the country you're locating some of these generating assets. So it's been allowed into the mix through regulators and certain administrations. I think people have not pushed back aggressively enough because in this country, electricity demand has been flatlining for the last couple of decades. And there are reasons for that, mainly offshoring manufacturing since the year 2000. But now that's reversing, right? We now have an economy that is seeing a surge in electricity demand, mainly from data centers and the technology sector. And clearly, intermittent wind and solar generation doesn't work. And if you need more proof, just look at the data center sponsors who are now trying to figure out what their delivery mechanism will be for 24/7 power, which is what they need. And they're not building dedicated wind and solar projects. They're using natural gas. They're restarting nuclear power plants. So that would be just further confirmation that wind and solar don't work. And we've had ample warning about this. If you look at recent reports out of the Department of Energy, the North American Electricity Reliability Corporation, NERC, they both have been warning about the fact that all of these intermittent renewables that we've pushed into the American grid, the regional grids as well as the regulated state markets, is going to lead to a problem over the next 5 years. Because effectively what we've started to do is replace dispatchable power with intermittent power. And that clearly is not going to work if we have load growth at roughly 1% to 2% per year. So I think we need to get back to first principles. only dispatchable power is allowed into the grid. We should stop making excuses for wind and solar. It places a burden on dispatchable power on top of being intermittent because of the pricing distortions that it creates, because there is technically no fuel cost on their side and all the subsidies that are being used to promote this construction. So I think if you disaggregate the whole argument about wind and solar, it just doesn't hold up. And hopefully the fact that we need reliable power now to meet our growing demands will get everyone on the same page in terms of how we fix the reliability issue that we're facing around the American grid. Yeah, I think it's important that we build what we know, and clearly we know how to build large-scale nuclear reactors. We just completed 2 AP1000 reactors in Georgia. Despite the sticker shock and some of the misperceptions about that project, we can do that again at a much lower cost based on what we learned through that construction exercise. So we should build what we know, what we've de-risked, and clearly the Vogtle project de-risked the AP1000 for the entire industry. If people will just stop and think about that. We need to bring in new construction sponsors because electric utilities have become much more of a risk-averse set of companies and not willing to take the risk that you have around nuclear construction anymore. But that's a fixable problem. In terms of what we need to do right now, again, proof of concept. We need to see a series of large-scale nuclear reactors, AP1000s. I would recommend started up, and we should have a goal of completing 10 of them, each 1.1 gigawatt per reactor over the next 5+ years. These reactors take 5 years to complete. Again, so it's going to take a while for this to come online. But I think over the next 1 to 5 years, in order to get 10 gigawatts plus of new nuclear capacity online, we need to see a startup, right? How do we make that happen? I think the federal government has an important role to play in that, as well as state governments. The Trump administration is already proposing to reform the NRC. They've had a stretch goal that they've set of quadrupling our nuclear capacity. That's all a favorable tailwind for getting these projects up and running. I think they should help to streamline the siting and permitting for these new set of reactors. Let's say we target 10 immediately. There's a list that the DOE has recently prepared, which identifies those existing nuclear power plants that have capacity for expansion, as well as those retired coal power plants where you could add a new nuclear reactor. I mean, both those categories of sites would have existing transmission infrastructure. So again, that will help to fast track these projects. And then we just need to see proof of execution. The federal government can also help by having the DOE, through its loan program office, earmark cheaper credit, debt guarantees for some of these nuclear projects. That's going to be a temporary support mechanism. Eventually, the private financial markets will step in once they see that this process and concept can work. But I think the federal government should do what it can to fast track this. In fact, I would recommend that the Trump administration have an outreach program to Wall Street, to specific infrastructure private equity fund managers, as well as banks, to get them on board with this concept. Again, infrastructure is a very hot category in the private equity space, as well as the debt space, right? So if the federal government can allay everyone's fears about the historical delays that we've had to deal with, mainly from the NRC, going away based on the reforms that they're instituting right now, and why past is not prologue for the nuclear industry, then I think you'll see a lot of financial institutions get on board. So I think we just need to get the process started, right? And then once you have proof of concept, again, the federal government can step back and let the private markets take over.